Here we are again. I'm John Atack. This is Dr. Stephen Moffic. Um, and we're going to talk about current events, which I've been largely avoiding, with sort of a blanket over my head since the 5th of November last year.
Yeah, I mean, lots is going on in the United States and the world, obviously,
Mm.
and so much of that affects people's mental health, which is, part of my concern and interest. So, tricky though, as I think I've told everybody before in interviews, psychiatrists are supposed to be a little careful and not talk about public people from our knowledge base.
The Goldwater rule after
Yes,
Barry Goldwater, yeah.
which needs some updating, I think, but
Oh,
it's
for
it's still
sure.
there.
Yeah. The ridiculous idea that you can't diagnose somebody unless you've met them and taken them through, the right series. And there are some things that are just obvious.
But it's more
Like,
than diagnosis, John. I probably the general public may be good enough in making a diagnosis sometimes from a public figure's behavior, and then
mm,
they just, look up psychiatric conditions that fit that. But it's much more than that. We're not supposed to publicly comment on any of our knowledge base that relates to the given individual. So it's not just diagnosis. That would be, I don't know. To me, that's less important because
mm,
some diagnoses are actually helpful when you're president, believe it or not, it seems to be. Others are not, and it depends on the time and what's going on. So diagnosis by self isn't a disqualifier from our point of view.
mm.
So what I generally do is talk about policies and procedures rather and let people imply who I'm talking about, and without saying so. So
Mm. No members of the Kennedy family will be mentioned in this discussion. There we are.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I can comment on what comes out of the Kennedy family or particular interviews without
Mm,
highlighting a particular person or
mm.
people.
Yeah, it's not Caroline Kennedy, though.
Right. Yeah, we can't even, that's the absurdity of the whole thing. We can't even really talk about, well, this public figure or this leader really is a good model for healthy mental health. We can't even explain that. It's such an overall suppression,
Mm,
of really our free speech. So some psychiatrists will just ignore it and say, "Who cares what the American Psychiatric Association says?"
mm,
Um, Technically, the rule only applies if you're a member of the organization, and so if you're not a member, it it shouldn't apply to you. Except other organizations, including news organizations, take it as pertaining to the world. So if the APA has this policy, the news organizations may take that into account and not want to talk to psychiatrists. So,
mm.
because we won't tell them anything juicy. So,
I mean, it suggests something about the mental health of whoever brought this stupid rule in. What can I say?
mhm,
And I'm not going to name them either. But
yeah.
oh dear. So health policy in the US now, um, we have somebody who I'm not going to name who has been campaigning for years against psychiatric medicines, and who, as we both know, employs a law firm headed by a Scientologist, who was himself an unindicted co-conspirator in the cases in 1980 and 81, where 11 Scientologists were sent to prison in the United States. He was one of the 38 unindicted co-conspirators, and he now runs a law firm. And for some years, I think they're probably up against Ritalin and Prozac. Those are the two things that Scientology has been going up against since they came into being. And I can, absolutely appreciate some caution about the use of pharmaceuticals. I think that's very sensible. But when we get into the kind of medieval propaganda that is being handed out, we come to somewhere different. Do you have concerns about the effects upon psychiatry in the US from health policies that may well emanate from the new administration? Let's call them that.
Yeah, because if there's new, especially legal guidelines of what psychiatrists can and can't do to help, certainly there's concern. I mean, we've already seen that in some of the states in regards to transgendered individuals,
Yes.
that physicians, including psychiatrists, can't help them along their transition.
Mm.
And that and I worked with a transgendered for 15 years as medical director of a clinic. And among other things, they're about the most courageous patients I ever saw. But clearly, their mental health improves as they go through the transition process and get to a state where they feel that their physiology is correlating with their gender that they feel they are inside. And so cutting that off, which has happened in many states, obviously hurts their mental health. So if the same thing happens with medications, will it cause harm? Uh, Probably. It depends what medicines we're talking about and what kind of blanket prohibition it is, but it fits into the whole way psychiatry has been influenced in recent years, which is outside the purview of psychiatrists. So I think this is true in England, maybe for different reasons, but in the United States, big business has taken over medicine. And what that means is psychiatrists are led to provide what the businesses thinks are the correct treatments, and that goes along with what's being paid for. So our whole field has been slanted toward providing medications
Mm.
rather than different psychotherapies because they're viewed as cheaper. I once wrote a book about that in 1997 because it's really the biggest ethical quandary in the field.
And
Still,
what was the book
all that
called?
it's called The Ethical Way: Challenges and Solutions for Managed Behavioral Healthcare,
Hmm.
1997, Josie Bass.
Wow.
It was actually reviewed twice, once when it came out, and from the same journal about 15 years later, because the issues are still there.
Yeah.
And and so when people, and there are organizations that criticize psychiatrists for using too much medications, our hands are tied. We don't actually want to do that, but
Mm.
it's our main option that's allowed from a financial and
Mhm.
organizational point of view. We'd rather be doing more psychotherapy and have more time with patients, but this is an outside influence that we don't control.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something like that in England. So that's a big prohibition on our field. So if you then start taking away more even of the medications we used to help, what are we left with?
Yeah.
Or more importantly, what are patients left with?
Mm.
It's we don't go out there and bring in patients to see. Patients come because they're suffering
Yes.
and they haven't found any other resource that will help, whether that's religious, friends, family, nothing else has helped. So we're in a way a last resort,
Mm.
and a last resort with good track records. Now, like you said, I wouldn't completely defend our use of medications. That can certainly be improved, but our general outcome with patients is the equal of other general physicians, like general
Yeah.
practitioners, interns, and so forth. We have good results with patients. They're not ideal. They're not where we want to go.
Mm.
Probably the big reason for our being stuck in certain ways is the brain is just so hard to research. It's so well protected, thankfully. But it's really hard to do research on the brain because it's so hard to get to.
Mm.
So, but we keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, recently there's talk of the brain microbiome, and
Yeah,
that this is really a new world altogether. That there could be all sorts of organisms partying inside our brains. Um,
exactly. Yeah.
And of course, the thing with psychiatry is, somebody goes to a doctor and they have some affliction, you can't necessarily cure it, but you can ease the symptoms. You can make it easier to live with. So the drugs that we have, for example, for Parkinson's disease,
Mhm.
have proved ever more effective over the last couple of decades by putting things into the system that will help you produce the dopamine that will mean that you can deal with the condition. I mean, my background. I spent 9 years in a group in Scientology that is absolutely rabidly anti-psychiatry. And this was fascinating for me because Ron Hubbard, the creator of the man who dreamed Scientology up, let's say, was profoundly opposed to psychiatry to such an extent that he said that psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychotherapists, fundamentally anybody with the term psych at the beginning of their appellation, are part of a huge conspiracy to destroy all life in the universe. I mean, is that true, Steve?
Well, it would sure be nice to have an outside investigation comparing, quote, treatment outcomes in
Hmm.
Scientology to psychiatry as usual, an
Well,
outside objective study.
Well,
Um,
there was a study of Hubbard's Dianetics done by Chicago University in about 1951, and they concluded it didn't work. Um, if you're dealing with somebody who has psychiatric problems, has a mental illness, Scientology won't even attempt to treat such people. Hubbard designed what he called the introspection rundown when he was aboard his ship in the Mediterranean. And I've talked, there are interviews on this channel with Mike Grinder and Karen de la Carrière, who were on his ship at the time. Karen had a very senior position. She was working at the top of his auditing technology, or hypnotism, as I think of it. And Mike had just arrived on the ship and was guarding this poor man who had been. He'd apparently, I pieced the story together very gradually over the years. He had said that he wanted to kill Hubbard because I think he'd realized that he'd spent a huge amount of money that he couldn't afford, and he was annoyed. And so he'd said this thing about killing Hubbard. He didn't try and kill him, just said something. So Hubbard had him locked up, and he was held prisoner in a tiny little cabin, and nobody was allowed to talk to him. And after a few weeks, Hubbard declared that he now had a cure for insanity. All he had to do was to remove all communication from the person, and they'd be well. What is not added to that, and this introspection rundown is used, but what's not added to that is that this guy left the ship and was never seen again. So they had no idea what his condition was afterwards. And treating somebody in that way, just locking them up and isolating them is not a new idea when it comes to people who have mental illness. And it didn't work in the past and it doesn't work now. So that Scientology is actively trying to destroy psychiatry. You know, I
yeah,
I talked with this was a rumor that went around, and I didn't believe it that there'd been a conference of psychiatrists where LSD was put into the toothpaste by a Scientologist, and I thought, well, that's just a silly story. And then a guy called Mike McCloughery, I think I've got his surname right, could be McCloughery, who had worked in Scientology's harassment division, the Guardian's office, said, yeah, I interviewed the woman who did this. So she went to a conference and put a little dab of LSD into the toothpaste in all of the hotel rooms. And that's kind of deeply irresponsible. They tried to take over the National Institute for Mental Health in this country in 1968, which is now called Mind, by suddenly joining hundreds of people joining up as members and voting to put themselves in charge. This is a very active campaign. And to see now that somebody who was part of that campaign, the lawyer you mentioned who's working for a certain person in the US government at the moment, to find that that person now is in a position of potential influence over psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy in the United States is deeply alarming, especially when we find that every Scientology center in the world has somebody who has the job to do this. So they're all, and that's hundreds of people, they're all meant to be aiming at people like you and your profession and undoing it. I mean, it's not as if you've not got enough trouble with having to deal with patients, let alone, this
Yeah,
from people who they have no alternative, they have nothing to offer, and they have no understanding of what mental illness is, and they dismiss the brain as a simple switchboard between the spirit and the body. So we don't
yeah,
need to know anything about it, which is crazy.
yeah, yeah. It's very worrisome, and um, just to be sure everybody understands my word of the use, treatment in
Mm.
Scientology. There were quotes around that. I didn't
Yes,
really mean real treatment. It was
we're just
facetious. Yeah,
treatment.
I should have done this. Um, and it's not to say that some people or lots of people don't feel better at certain
Mm.
times when they get involved with Scientology. Um, but as far as psych psychiatry's psychiatry is a field that developed because no one else, no other organization in the world could help people who had
Mm.
major problems with their brain and mind.
Yeah.
Like I said, religion couldn't, locking them up in prisons didn't help, and so on. So the field had to develop as a last resort. So it's
Mm.
not like it went out to capture people and make money off of them. And it's very hard for people in general often to realize they have psychiatric problems
Yeah.
because it affects your whole being. It's like
Mm.
you sort of feel change as a person and not as much in control of yourself. And
Yeah.
actually, our overall goal is to free somebody's mind, not to suppress it. But
Yeah.
psychiatric illness does this, and people in the midst of that have trouble making, quotes, rational
Mm.
decisions because of the illness. And people try to find, and families sometimes try to find somebody to blame for what's happened to their loved one
Of
or
course.
themselves. And psychiatry is an easy organization to blame
Mm.
because we usually don't fight back. We just try to do what we can to help when we can.
Mm.
And but the field is one that's needed. Otherwise, it would have never developed in the first place, or it would have gone away just by experience of people, say from Scientology. Psychiatry would be gone by now
Mm.
if it wasn't important and effective.
Mm.
And it just gets more effective and more desired by people as time goes on. Again, that's not to say we do everything right all the time. For sure, that's not, and we shouldn't claim anything like that. But we do have strong ethical codes, and those are monitored, and our results, our outcome studies are there all the time. So,
Mm.
um, if people believe in science, which sometimes is more questionable nowadays, we have the science to back us up. Cure, like you brought up, not all that often. I would suggest to you that people who have transgendered issues generally are cured
Yeah.
completely by going through the process. So
Yeah.
it's not unheard of. Um, so there are certain situations where patients do seem to be cured, but most of the time it's improvement that we're looking for.
Mm.
So there's so many concerns about mental health now. So it's medications, especially with kids and
Mm.
adults. It's spread to SSRIs. Zoloft is the one that's coming out most in publicity. Antipsychotics are too, and so it's in essence any psychiatric medication is being endangered now.
Mm.
And then at the same time, we've already been in a situation where psychiatric disorders are increasing year by year.
Yeah.
We don't have adequate manpower, and our government is laying off thousands and thousands of people suddenly. And what do these people end up having? They have unresolved grief, depression, anxiety. How are they going to find the next job? So you
Mm.
just need more help now, not less. So that's what we're all worried about. Um, Also, the whole cultural issue of what's called DEI, but essentially how minorities are taken care of in psychiatry and elsewhere. So that's all also being threatened. So
Mm.
that's what makes this time so worrisome. The individual you may be talking about, I'm not sure, you know, has an interesting history from what he's publicly said or reliable people have written about him. Um, his father was apparently murdered when he was 14 years old, assassinated. It was after that that he developed what he says were his problems with substances
Mm.
overuse, and had those problems for a long time. Along the way, he found out that self-help groups like AA and so forth seemed to help. Not only that, he did rely on a psychiatrist, not in treatment, but one of the favorite books that I heard of is a book called Synchronicity by the psychiatrist Carl Jung.
Mm.
And apparently, this person really loved the book. It was, in part, he might have fell in love with it because it had the same title as a police record album. But for
And of course,
somebody,
the concept was stolen by Jung from Paul Kammerer and called seriality originally. But let's not get too deep here. But I do regard Jung as a charlatan. I'm sorry. That's I've recently been looking in.
I'm not defending Jung.
Yeah,
I'm just
I
saying
know you're not. I know you're not.
he
I know you're not. I just
he
want everybody to know that's what I feel.
he seemed to value this input of
Mm.
psychiatrists,
Yeah.
despite anything that might be said now. Um, so I think this individual that we may be talking about has some contradictory things in his background that are hard to tease out. So another area of concern to mental health, at least, well, somewhat directly, somewhat indirectly, is the environment.
Mm.
And so this individual apparently has been very involved with environmental issues for many years
Mm.
in a very positive way that may not be continuing now because of the circumstances he's in. But he has some positive things as I understand it in his background. So, but this control coming from above is what anybody who's working in the government now has to deal with, fall into place, and follow. Otherwise, they won't have jobs. So, in other words, it sounds somewhat like a cult.
Yeah, I hear your country is being renamed Trumperica.
Right. Yeah. It's
There are big gold statues going up all over Gaza. And where are we living, Steve? What has happened in the world?
yeah. It's happening so fast.
Mm.
And so for those who might want to oppose what's going on, this is such a blitzkrieg. It reminds me of Germany's invasion of France in World War II. It was just a blitzkrieg.
Mm.
All these armies coming into undefended France and taking over one, two, three, and this is what it's felt like to me.
Mm.
Again, for without putting too much value judgment on it, this is what's happened. And so those who have opposition, and it's probably only half of our country, the other half is cheering, and so, but the opposition can't catch up with this, and so um, it looks like we're kind of at the mercy for the time being of whatever the repercussions of all these changes are. Too many, too fast. And when people say, well, we have checks and balances and our courts will help, and that's not necessarily true. The courts have changed and are
Mm.
more Republican nowadays, and so I don't know if that's going to be any factor that's going to slow things down or not.
Yeah, I mean, everything rests with the Supreme Court and the integrity of the justices there, and whether they will uphold the amendment granting birthright citizenship, which was, I believe, last challenged in 1898 at the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Whether there'll be anything, is it the 25th Amendment, the one that's about the the capacity, the competence of the president.
Yes, you got it right.
Yeah, which was not used with Reagan, and which is interesting because he pretty much had dementia at the end.
Yeah,
And of course, you had Woodrow Wilson, who had some pretty serious psychotic
yeah,
problems way
yeah,
back. Yeah, yeah. And that thing you mentioned. I mean, you're a social psychiatrist, so you look at the effects on the mental health of the population. And as you say, saying we're going to sack 200,000 people, we're going to sack 10% of this force, without really necessarily working out who's efficient and who's not, and what's needed and what's not. And so there will be that uncertainty, that anxiety. If we look
yeah,
back historically, of course, that is how the fascist regimes took over in Europe,
yeah.
in
I
Portugal,
mean,
Spain, Italy, and
even the
Germany.
even the worst corporations in the United States will try to cushion people when they're laid off or fired.
Mm.
They'll
With
give
the
them
possible
some
exception of Tesla and
severance
SpaceX.
money or understand they
Mm.
need some mental health transition help, one way or another. So this goes beyond what any cruelty our usual corporations do in the United States when they let go people. This is worse.
Yeah, and we're moving into a very simple paradigm, which is some people call it the just world paradigm. Some people talk about karma. There's the idea that if something awful happens to you, it's because of something awful you've done. And it's impossible to prove such a ridiculous idea because it's a ridiculous idea. And so to try and create a society without compassion, the order of love, as the Pope pointed out to J.D. Vance, is not in fact a Christian concept. The Christian concept is as is the Jewish concept, as is the Muslim concept, that you should have compassion. That's at the heart of Buddhism. It's at the heart of Hinduism. You should have compassion. And we're seeing people saying, well, if something bad happened to you, it's your own fault, which of course is also a driving principle within Scientology. They will say, you pulled it in, it's whatever happened to you. It's a driving principle in Christian Science, in many places. And it's such a dangerous idea. You're responsible for everything that happens to you. There are no accidents, because how on earth could the universe work with with such precision that every act of every ant and every you know chaffinch is going to be somehow interacting? You come to an idea that ultimately means there is no free will, there is no power of decision. Everything is mechanical. Once you've got past the first few acts of the universe, the rest will inevitably unpack. And it leads to callousness and cruelty. And that
Yeah,
callousness is the fundamental condition of the psychopathic or sociopathic disorder. And we have a
mhm.
society that is becoming more narcissistic, more sociopathic. Um,
Well, I don't know
and
about more sociopathic. Well, I guess you're right. I mean,
yeah,
what I see there from working in prison, where a fair number of people were diagnosed as
mm,
sociopaths, not too often by me, but other people, is studies indicate there's way more sociopaths in outside of prisons than in. I think
yeah,
what our
they're mainly in
time does,
government, aren't they?
our, yeah, our
And
time
running the
does is
corporations.
it opens the doors for these sociopaths,
Mm,
who have been clever enough to hide how dangerous they are, but nowadays they just let it all out. It doesn't matter. They're not going to get into trouble and so forth. And yeah, they're certainly a big danger. And and for those people, unfortunately, I think psychiatry is not a good resource to help because they're
mm,
almost impossible to treat usefully in any way. And so with them, you're either left with recognizing who they are
mm.
and get them some sort of incarceration, or they're just going to be there forever. So so there's extra danger in those people outside of prisons, and there's many more of them than in prisons.
Mm. And we, this policy announced the other week of the gold card. If you pay $5 million, you can become an American citizen and live there. And you're going, so they're emptying out the prisons of all of the soldiers who run the drug cartels and sending them back home. And they're inviting the leaders of drug cartels to become American citizens. It's like, okay. Uh, and this is an idea that money is the indicator of your goodness. And
Yeah,
so somebody, it struck me the other day that this idea of a $500 billion deal for minerals in Ukraine. And I went, well, that's as much money as Elon Musk's got. He's already got what would have presumed to be the half of the future mineral reserves of, and I think that's a bit too much personally, especially if you can't be bothered to dress properly to go and lecture cabinet meetings.
hmm
What a strange man. That, yeah, I mean, a point that came up in my mind while we were talking, that before psychiatry, you had Bedlam. You had this idea of, we had three locations in this country where Bedlam operated, where you would take people who were acting strangely and you would put them in squalid conditions. And at the weekend, guests would pay to come and watch them abusing one another, sort of a
as
replacement
if
for
they
the,
were animals just
yeah,
in a zoo or something. Yeah.
yeah, something like the Roman circus. And that was what there was before psychiatry came along. And then, as you said, psychiatry has been overwhelmed from the beginning by there being too many people. Then you had this idea which came in under Margaret Thatcher of care in the community. And the idea was that we'd have less places in our mental hospitals and the community would care for these people. Alongside this, homelessness, or rough sleeping as it's now called here, multiplied by the exact amount of people who were being cared for in the community. When I was a kid in the 60s, we well, you might find the occasional World War I veteran begging cigarettes on the street. Now, if I go into Nottingham or any big city, every 20 yards, I'm going to see a homeless person who probably could do with some help, who probably,
Well,
could be helped.
that's a money issue too.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack a little bit, um, psychiatry really developed to try to get out of that bedlam state.
Mm,
Dorothy Dix and some other people made reports to the public, and what some psychiatrists, old psychiatrists like Pinnell did, is set up moral treatment in hospitals. In other words,
mm,
if people are going to stay in hospitals who had mental illness a long time, they were in danger to themselves or other people, at least make the conditions humanistic. And
yes.
they did. They were really nice places to stay for a long time. But what you mentioned in the community is so important because, yeah, that developed in both countries, United States and England. United States, it started to develop under President Kennedy, the middle late 60s.
Mm,
And actually, it was a great movement. And
mm,
money was supposed to be transferred from the state hospitals to outpatient settings, and the government supplanting that with more money.
yeah.
And some of the mental health centers that developed, up to 700 of them, were just terrific, actually.
Mm,
But along came President Reagan and decimated this federal program.
mm,
He established what he called block grants, where the money to these community mental health centers could be used for roads, not that that's not good, used for roads and everything else but mental health treatment. And so this whole system fell apart. More homelessness occurred, more
mm,
homelessness with mental illness, but it really was the right way to go things. It just needed the money to continue
mm,
and to leave it in the hands of the professionals, not the politicians. I mean, in a way, it's the same thing we're talking about now, but just a different situation. So that
mm,
situation was our system of mental health care. Now it's reducing the care of patients who have gender disorders and medication and abortion and all this other stuff of the government playing doctor. I
yeah.
mean, maybe they should have gone to medical school. Actually, I shouldn't say that because there's lots of fair number of politicians who are also physicians, and they do the same thing other politicians do. Once you get in that system, it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. And I mean, there was another extreme way of treating mental conditions, but because I've spent the last, how long is it, 5 months, 6 months reading around the Nazis, I have read about their form of treatment, and their form of treatment was to kill people. And perhaps 250,000 schizophrenics were killed. They also, when they invaded a country, and I'm not sure this is widely known, they would kill everybody in the psychiatric hospitals so that the beds could be used for their troops if they were needed. So that's another attitude towards the mentally ill. And it's worth saying that the only survey I'm aware of in Germany, because they got rid of 250,000 poor people under this program. So you kind of go, well, what are their rates of schizophrenia now, dare I ask? And Germany seems to have the highest rates of schizophrenia in a survey of 11 countries. So it did not solve the problem if one is going to be, that, lacking in compassion. It didn't solve the problem. And you have this other problem, which is people of sociopathic disposition who rise high in these systems
Yeah.
and develop a sort of complete callousness towards others that don't have any concern. There's also the knock-on effects, by taking money out of US aid and stopping foreign programs against disease, that those diseases will therefore spread. By not giving treatment to the poor in your own country, diseases will spread from those populations if you don't look after them. And I think that's a very worrying situation in the United States at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Schizophrenics, like you said, were the first target of the Nazis.
Yeah.
And in part because of the stigma about mental illness, I think they probably thought, oh, we can get away easily with this. And they did. So they were an early target. And probably once they saw that was easy and successful, they could spread out to other targets to purify Germany. Of course.
Yeah, and to be fair, those eugenics programs, the Nazis picked
Came out of
them
the
up.
United States. Came out of the United States.
United States, Sweden. But in 1920, there was already a sterilization program in Germany being run by Protestant churches and supported by them. So they picked up the Action T4, where they started to sterilize people, if you were deaf, if you were blind, all sorts of conditions, spasticity would be treated with sterilization with no real effect. It didn't change anything in the overall population. This idea of breeding thoroughbreds, this sort of mock Darwinian idea, it's a nonsense. We don't know how to do it. And when we look at the horses and the dogs and the things that we have bred, we find out they have terrible problems, like all the dogs with pushed in faces that are born with asthma, or the King Charles Spaniel, where the brain case is not big enough for the brain. And so they'll develop psychotic conditions. That's what we've learned how to make things prettier, and we've learned how to make them go down holes and chase badgers, the dachshund. But we have, this attempt to breed human beings went monstrously wrong and undermined, if we do not have compassion, we don't have anything. If we're not pro-social, if we're not for the society, for other people, we won't make a good society. It's that easy, isn't it?
No, I mean, the best we can do, nature is really important. Genetics is really important.
Of course.
Also very, very complex.
Yeah.
But the best we can do is raise kids healthier from a mental health and physical health standpoint. So essentially, we're reliant on parents and then schools to help human beings turn out the best they can.
Yeah.
Infants have a predilection to both be altruistic and selfish. Yeah. And it depends how the parents handle that, which way they go, and what kind of trauma they're exposed to, and so forth. So if we want healthier people from a mental health standpoint, right now it basically resides in raising them the way we know better results will turn out. There'll be surprising things that happen to kids no matter what you try to do as parents or teachers, but um, we can do a lot just by being better parents and better teachers.
And traditionally, um, children have been physically abused, corporal punishment for centuries. And I
Yeah,
think what we are seeing in the, our generation with this move towards, Montaigne, the brilliant Montaigne in the 16th century said that although it was expected of him to beat his daughter, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And I'm like that. That I've got 4 kids. I've never struck a child. It's a ridiculous idea to me.
well, it's okay to think about it. But
Yeah, well, it's okay to say it as well occasionally. But
probably every parent has had a thought of, I'd like to
mm,
kill this kid or whatever,
yeah.
but you just don't do it. And you don't do anything close to that, right?
Mm. And
Just kind of,
I'm sorry, what we found is that um, definitely the science supports the idea that kindness leads to better outcomes. So you have somebody to say, like the neurologist James Fallon, who's written about his own pro-social sociopathy. And
yeah.
and he says that he, until he was 50, he believed that everything was genetic. And then he had brain scans done of 9 of his family members and himself. They had them randomized, and one of them had the connection between the prefrontal lobes and the limbic system was atrophied, as it tends to be in sociopaths. And he said, "Oh, who's this?" And his assistant went, "It's you." And he then gradually worked out that his mother had told him, "You were different as a toddler. There was something about you that," and so she had treated him differently. And she had basically inhibited his nasty tendencies. He still, he talks about taking his brother to the Marburg caves in Kenya. And it's only when his brother got home, he said, "This is where Ebola came from, isn't it?" So he's a risk taker. He does those kind of things. He says, if he's booked to go to a funeral and somebody says there's a party, he'll go to the party. And he wants to take the professor with the spectacles along and have him dancing naked on the table by the end of the day. But the vicious aspect of his sociopathy is gone. He's a risk taker. He's a prankster. And that is absolutely to do with nurture. So
Yep.
we dealt these cards. How are we going to play them? Teach us how to play them. And it looked, I mean, it looked in the 70s as if we were going very much in the right direction. The Vietnam War stopped. That was a really good thing.
Yeah.
And there was more and more, you know, touchy feely, more and more, trying to deal with problems and make people feel better. We
Yeah.
seem to be swinging back into a kind of Victorian viciousness
Yeah.
and contempt for people, which is appalling and frightening.
Yeah. And it seems like in society and in history, it does tend to go back and forth. Again, I hate to put all this on President Reagan, but once he became president, sort of greed just escalated in the United States. We have this famous saying that came out of one of the Wall Street movies, greed is good. But
Yeah.
that's essentially what was emphasized
Mm.
in the United States. So all the kindness and concern for other people and compassion seemed to go by the wayside as money greed, took over. And I'm not one to bash capitalism as a whole, but I think it's gotten out of hand, especially with these ultra billionaires now who want to enter politics and are starting to control people's lives. I mean, it's bad enough if they just had all this money and kept it to themselves instead of using it in a philanthropic way to help
Mm.
people. But I think our capitalism is sort of out of control now.
Yeah, I mean, um, President Trump has said that he's often talked. When I first heard the slogan "Make America Great Again," it was sort of, which period are we referring to? What's the period that you want to return us to? What's the golden age of America that you want to return us to? And he finally, the end of last year, said from 1870 to 1913. Now, I would thoroughly recommend people look at the history of the United States during that time. That's when the Statue of Liberty goes up. That's when immigration is at its highest. You're starving, huddled masses and all of that.
Yeah.
Millions of people coming in, with the exception of the Chinese, who were excluded in 1882 from entering the United States because they worked too hard. We can't have that. But you had these waves of immigration, but you also had Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore. You also had Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. These utterly unscrupulous monsters. And one of the things that amused me is that, of course, during that period, McKinley was put forward as president for a second term. And to stop Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of the rich, but was making bad noises about people being too rich, they put him in the position of vice president, thinking, yeah, that's a place, yeah, all you can do is be rude to foreign leaders. That's your whole remit as vice president. And McKinley was shot. So in this, when America was great, Teddy Roosevelt comes in and starts the trust busting, starts saying these corporations are too big. We have to divide out the power. It wasn't successful, but it was the right thought. Sadly, we still do have the huge Ford money, the Rockefeller money, the Getty money, all of these things. They still exist. And I suppose it's a kind of mental disorder in our society, this idea that somebody who has enough wealth to feed themselves for 2.5 million years while there are other people starving is considered to be a good person. It's like,
Yeah.
I think our morality, if you look at the Plains Indians, the Lakota and the Cheyenne, their mark was, how generous are you? Right the way up to the Northwest and the Tlingit and up, the Aleutian Islands. So if you went buffalo hunting, whoever killed the most buffalo had to give them all away.
Yeah. It's when there's criticism of psychiatry doing too much, I would probably counter with that we do too little. There's this wide area of human development that goes from, quotes, normality on up to mental disorders. But the kind of thing you're bringing up, sort of personality characteristics or desires like greed that we've been talking about, social psychopathologies, racism, anti-Semitism, and so forth, all those things are essentially ignored by psychiatry. So we got this gap between normality to full-blown mental disorders rather than looking at the whole spectrum of health and mental health.
Yeah.
And how can we do better along the whole way? For instance, I think psychiatry and psychologists and social workers and so forth, everybody in the field could be of help in addressing some of the social pathologies that we have going on, but we don't pay any attention to it. And the personality characteristics that we want to reinforce in development, we could do so much more that might even help reduce some of the mental disorders that stem out of much more minor issues. So, but that whole area is just, it's a blank area and it's vulnerable to outside other forces like Scientology.
Yeah, like Scientology. I'm going to put in a plug here. You very likely haven't seen this book. It's just come out here. It's by an Oxford neurophysiologist, Our Brains, Ourselves. I'm about halfway through it. And I read a book about, I read 20 or 30 books about the brain over the years because I was not meant to as a Scientologist. So, of course, I took to it. As soon as I left, I read Oliver Sacks' Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is brilliant. And understanding that mental illness is not, you're not simply dealing with people being sane or mad. There are disorders, there are 200 named brain regions, and something can go wrong in any one of them. And a person is not delusional. They don't necessarily have hallucinations, so they don't have delusive beliefs. They don't see things or hear things, but they may not be able to perceive certain things. And this is an excellent book talking about I think he has 7 patients that he saw who had different conditions. One of them was losing language, had an aphasia, and another has Alzheimer's. And looking at what constitutes these things, what brain regions are associated with these things, and what treatments there are. And he is able to make people's lives better, to ameliorate their condition. And so I think again, half of my audience are people who are phobic about psychiatry, and because they've had all of this brainwashing that their brains don't need to be washed. They've had all this brainwashing that their brains are irrelevant, and to get over that phobia in our society and say we do need a much better understanding, as you've just said, of the whole spectrum of health, what health is, and in fact, it's a three-dimensional spectrum. It's really not simple. How rational people are. We live in a world where probably it would be fair to say the vast majority of human beings, and certainly me, are not rational. um,
Yeah.
and
We
the
have this.
anti-science movement that's going on at the moment is just
Yeah. Yeah. We have this. Human beings have this spectrum. I don't even know exactly how we would define normality, but whatever it is, it goes on to small disturbances in mental health, maybe the bigger ones, and so forth. There's something about our terminology that's a problem too. I don't know. Well, maybe problem is not the right word, but in our diagnostic classification system in the United States, which is used around the world,
yeah.
we don't call mental conditions illnesses.
Mm,
Uh, and that term is flippantly used by us, the public, and the media.
mm,
Uh, it's not a diagnostic classification of mental illnesses.
mm,
No, that's not the term used. It's disorders.
yeah.
And for good reason, because we don't really know yet if these conditions are really illnesses in the way that medical illnesses are illnesses, if that
Mm,
makes sense.
it does. Yeah.
We just need more data. Now, Alzheimer's disease, yeah, you can definitely say it's a disease or an illness. It doesn't need to be called a disorder, but
Mm,
everything in our manual is called a disorder, not an
mm,
illness, not a disease. And I think that's an important distinction. It says we have to learn a lot more about what disorder means and how that evolves over time and so forth. But it is not the same as the rest of medicine,
mm.
even though we're part of medicine. Again, what we know about the brain so far is different, and in order of understanding, it's different. So, but we're catching up.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to underline that, as you say, with Alzheimer's, you're dealing with something physical that you can see, amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain. You can identify these things, and you can identify them directly from spinal fluid. And I think there are now blood tests that are beginning to work on it, because who wants a lumbar puncture? But there you are dealing with a disease. You're dealing with something that's gone wrong with the system that you can identify. If we then look at something like the vaguest of them all, post-traumatic stress disorder, which has 633,000 different combinations of symptoms, where major depression has 277. And so you've got this vague net that's been thrown out that's basically saying people are stressed because something horrible has happened to them, and they can't seem to get over it, and that becomes something. And then along the way you have something like, say, the borderline personality disorder, which is okay, not really sure that we know very much or understand very much about this. We're just saying this person behaves in this way. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid, in the words of A.A. Milne. That, and she could be he as well. I'm quoting exactly from A.A. Milne. That, as you say, these are disorders. The narcissistic personality disorder. With some of them, there seems we can look to a genetic component with some of the forms of bipolar have this brilliant man, Dr. John Hunter, who's done several things about bipolar disorder with on the channel. And it was really amazing. He's going, well, there are four different types. This is not a single condition. There are at least four groupings that we can get to, and they're quite different from one another. And and in understanding them, we see something about normal behavior because he, for example, talks about hypermania, the state before the mania is madness, where you're just a little bit too happy. And the way that cult groups, and particularly his study has been of large group awareness trainings like EST, Landmark, Forum, LifeSpring, Tony Robbins, where they are inducing symptoms of a mental illness. They're inducing what they call transformations and what we would recognize as hypomania or indeed mania. So they feel fantastic. They feel absolutely wonderful. And they go home, they divorce their spouse, they tell their boss to go and hang himself and ruin their lives.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you use good examples there because, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that probably mainly comes from outside undue stress, trauma.
Yeah, it's just all got too much. Yeah.
But there too, not everybody or not most of the people under those circumstances get PTSD. So there has to be some other factors that go into it. And then you borderline maybe is somewhere in between. We just extrapolate back to child rearing for what we see in people with borderline personality disorders, that we see a certain behavior and then think, oh, this behavior must have started to occur in childhood due to parental inconsistency, say.
Yeah.
And then you got bipolars, which seems mainly nature oriented. I mean,
yeah,
psychotherapy is not going to help bipolar disorder other than maybe to help the person accept that they have it, but
and manage it a little. Yeah,
to treat bipolar disorder because it's built in nature. So we do have this wide spectrum of potential causes of these different conditions. So hard to lump them all together.
But we also have an understanding of, say, with PTSD, that we talk about two distinct forms of this very amorphous condition. One, which I call, it used to be called battle fatigue, was called shell shock, where an instance or a couple of instances of horrific magnitude have shocked somebody out of their normal way of behaving. And that's kind of combat PTSD. But there's also the form of it which I think of as, it's called complex PTSD. It's not in DSM-5, but where somebody has been enslaved, their volition, their will has been taken from them. And knowing the outcome of these things, creating a society that is less stressful, that is more helpful. I could, when I was a kid and went to the doctor, it'd be what seems to be the trouble, and it was all sort of remote and over there. Nowadays, if I go to a good doctor, I come away feeling better because I've had attention paid to me. I've been listened to. That my problem is, and that's a tremendous and wonderful change. But here we are in a society which has its own stresses. We have wars going on in this world. But, I have a friend, my friend Yuval always says, the main cause of depression is lack of money.
It could contribute to that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's more everyday depression, sort of.
Yeah, and of course, yes, that's unhappiness, reactive depression, as opposed to endogenous or physiologically caused depression. But that knowing that upsetting people doesn't do them good, knowing that bullying people is harmful, that if you want to have a decent society, you need to become a decent person. And with kindness as your king, you will reach heaven before you reach your end, in the words of Dave Matthews. That seems to be really challenged in our society at the moment with the variety of populist dictatorships that have blossomed. And it I suppose behooves us to seek to behave well, to walk the walk, that we have talked.
Well, you just said two important things about psychiatry really, which maybe we didn't touch upon enough.
Mm,
One is time being listened to. You just talked about your physician giving you the time to be heard and
mm,
conveying that. Well, that doesn't happen so often in psychiatry anymore.
mm,
Not because we don't want to spend the time to understand people better, but it's again the system that requires us to only spend so much time, with patients. So
mm,
we don't get to know them as well as we should. They feel shortchanged with time, and so that's a deficit in the field nowadays for sure, but
mm,
not necessarily psychiatrists' fault. It's the fault of the systems. And then when that time is so short, it's very hard for psychiatrists to come across as being kind and compassionate. You're
mm,
trying to get what you need to get done, including writing on your computer, done within this small amount of time. And, so we come across as not caring when we really do care, but the system, again, isn't allowing that to come out the way we would like it to come out. So
mm.
I think so many of the problems in our field that people pick up on, yeah, some of them are probably our own doing or contribution, but it's more how we have to function in our systems of cost control and profit making, and not profit making by us.
Yeah, and as you started this conversation, the astonishing profits being made by pharmaceutical companies. Jon Stewart did a skit about this the other week, and where he's basically saying, so we give them tax breaks of billions of dollars, and they give us in return the
Mm.
most expensive medicines in the world. That the the greed has become essential. I mean, as a lapsed Buddhist, I know that the fundamental principle of Buddhism, when you say, how did it all happen? The answer is beginningless greed.
Yeah,
And
I agree. You know,
what can we do about it is to say, well, I've got enough. Let me share some of what I have with you, rather than you're fired, which is the other approach to life.
and now we have this whole category of substances, drugs,
Mm.
um, generally called the psychedelics.
Yeah.
And how that's going to fall out is really uncertain. So we have psychedelics, and maybe I'll just throw in marijuana, even though it's not a psychedelic, but
Mm.
stuff that the public uses on their own because that's their way of controlling how they get better. And
Self-medication.
yeah, and it seems like it's hit or miss whether it
Mm.
helps. And then you have all this research, not all this research, whatever research is going on formally, and you get one of the psychedelics turned down by the FDA in America because it looks like they didn't conduct the research properly. And here we are with these unusual substances that may be able to do things that
Mm.
nothing else can help. And okay, yes, maybe other things can help, like enough psychotherapy and child rearing, but also have limitations in that. It's really important to tease out these um, psychedelics, make them available in a reasonable way, um, not prone to being used to make more money,
Mm.
that they're investor-based developments, which they are tending to be now. So there's this kind of whole area out there that hasn't been solved yet, but potentially is really important for people's mental health. What's the role of psychedelics, small dose, reasonable dose, whatever, in people's lives and their own mental health? We just don't know, but it's
Mm.
out there sort of for the taking.
Yeah, I've had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Ethan Russo, who's been researching cannabis within pharmaceutical companies for decades. Um, he was involved for 11 years with development of Sativex by GW Pharmaceuticals. This is licensed in 30 countries. In this country where it was developed, it's still only available for multiple sclerosis because it is the only drug that assists smooth muscle function.
Mm.
But he was talking about a project he's working on right now where they have two geriatric homes. And in one of them, they're using um, cannabidiol, which is the precursor to all of the cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. It's not psychoactive in any way. Same as cannabinol, cannabinol, cannabidiol. This is what a day today. Spit it out, John. Spit it
Yeah,
out. But cannabidiol, what they found is that the people who have relatives in the on the home that where they're not using it are wanting to transfer their relatives into the one where they are using it because they have better sleep, they need less care, they have less difficulties. And you're going, that's a good enough reason, especially if we're dealing with people who are suffering from senility, let's
yeah.
call it that.
Sleep's really important. Sleep just by itself is really important for mental health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As you know, I have what is called a sleep disorder. I have delayed sleep-wake phase, and it came on when I was 11 years old. That I just didn't get to sleep until the very early hours of the morning, and I would get up after 3 or 4 hours sleep and go to school. And I had 10 years of dealing with that. And what you start doing is sleeping late at the weekends,
Mm.
so that you can try and catch up on the sleep debt, but it doesn't work. You can't
No,
you can't focus, your memory doesn't work properly, you can't
yeah,
concentrate. You are more susceptible to, your immune system is it functions less well. You generally walk around in a daze, as people who are sleep deprived do.
yes.
And I mean, it used to be said that 30% of people in this country were sleep deprived. I was there's this wonderful woman called Jessie Inchauspay, who calls herself the glucose goddess. She's a biochemist who has worked out that we've got way too much sugar in our diets. And she, watching this documentary the other week, she said 70% of people now in the UK are reckoned to be sleep deprived. And as you say, that will impact upon your physical and your mental health.
Yeah,
And I mean, I think that's something in our society that's kind of weird to me, that the great revolution in diet is happening in the UK. None of it coming out of the medical establishment directly. People like Professor Tim Spector, who is in the medical establishment, are saying we're eating the wrong things. We are screwing ourselves up physically and mentally by eating the wrong things, making
yeah.
our lives more stressful and feeling, worse about life because we're stuffing
In a way
ourselves
that
with sugar.
in a way that brings us back to where we started or close to where we started. This person we were talking about that works in our government now is is concerned about the food we eat,
Mm,
especially the additives that are in the food and so forth. Is that a good thing or not? I think it's probably a good thing, um, because nutrition is also such a difficult subject to
mm,
research well and understand. So, but I personally, I think there are some big problems with our general diets in the
yeah.
United States and the additives that are added to food. So maybe some help will come out of that. Um, and sleep itself is so crucial, and it's worse nowadays because of the internet and people keeping their phones on or looking at the computers right before they go to sleep and getting
Mm,
riled up. Besides the blue light or whatever
mm.
is making it harder for people to go to sleep. So we're being hurt by our own technology, and people can't pull back enough to get rested before they get in bed. They're keyed up
Mm.
because they're already and they'll keep their iPhones on and allow themselves to get woken during the night. All that is very unhealthy mentally.
Yeah, I mean that thing of people, leaving their alerts going during, so they can sit up and look at their phone in the middle of the night. And we have, four different phases of sleep. And if you don't get the deep sleep, then,
Yeah,
now there's again work on glial cells in the brain and the cleaning process in the brain, that if you don't get enough sleep, then the detritus builds up in your brain and, you're going to feel rotten. And
yes,
it's a kind of junky situation that we're looking at. People are becoming dependent upon these devices that are doing precisely what? You can doom scroll forever. There will always
yes,
be enough bad news in the world to upset you.
for
I think it
sure.
was MSNBC last week that maybe it was Ari Melber saying that 86% of people in the US get their news from social media. And you're going, so they're reading all this made up crap and it's
That's right.
upsetting them and, creating a distinct and new form of society.
Yeah.
Goebbels would be, delighted at the effect of propaganda, and how much people are being controlled by information. I interviewed the woman who wrote The Brainwashing of My Dad, Jen Senko, which is a fantastic little documentary and a wonderful book about how her father, who was a lovely, lovely man, was exposed to only right-wing media for a while and became intemperate and, vicious in his attitudes. And you see him recovering from it when her mum reprograms his computer so that those apps are all off, and he's now not getting Fox News and Rush Limbaugh or whatever. He's getting something close to an accurate picture of news, and he calms down. So it's like being an alcoholic, throwing yourself into this sea of bad news and upset and thinking that you're going to be healthy. You know,
Yeah.
you know,
And people are drawn to that, for better and worse. Our
mm,
predisposition is to pay more attention to bad news because that's dangerous. And that's how people became aware of danger
mm.
way, way back in
Oh
our
yeah.
origins, to watch for the bad stuff and not so much the good stuff. And
Mm,
we're still stuck with that. And
mm.
so it's easy to prey upon that tendency we have as human beings, and the stuff that seems bad nowadays probably isn't so bad like it was way back when, but we're overreacting to it. As you said, we get addicted to it. The addiction is
Mm,
built into the whole process in
mm.
social media. So it's a grave situation that doesn't look like there's any easy way out of it right now.
Yeah,
So
and it's almost the kind of religious mystics route, which is something that has fascinated me since I was a teenager, and I think I'm over it now. But I spent decades studying, Sufi texts and Zen texts and all sorts of things, Taoist texts, to try and understand these things. And there is tremendous virtue in them.
yeah, I
There
do
is
too.
there is tremendous virtue because they are talking about virtue, and you know
Mhm.
so there's a kind of choice. You can spend your time doom scrolling, or you can do something good in the world.
Yeah,
You can make something. You make something artistically beautiful, or you can give a kind word to a stranger who needs it, or you know, be, write a letter of complaint to the people who are doing the horrible things. There is something to be done, and it's too easy to just drown in a kind of vortex of bad news.
yeah. And you know what especially is not good? Um, this can go back to the White House meeting of Zelensky and Trump.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not going to talk about individuals, but the worst interpersonal thing you can almost do to a person without physically harming them is to humiliate them and denigrate them, because that causes backfire and
Mm.
it causes revenge.
Mm.
And to see two leaders going at it um, to each other rather than being conciliatory, positive, compassionate is really worrisome. Some people are much more susceptible to head on criticism, and you have to know who those people are because you don't want to call them out directly because they'll just retaliate. So not only does nothing get better if you criticize somebody who senses like that, it just makes the situation worse. And you don't want to humiliate anybody publicly. And again, there's differences in how people react to that. But the ones who are sensitive about being humiliated, I mean, I couldn't care at all about being humiliated now
Yeah,
because
yeah. We
I'm
get to an
older,
age. Yeah,
I have nothing to lose. Who
mm,
cares?
yeah,
But uh,
so
but
true.
otherwise, humiliating people publicly can really be harmful. And I think we saw examples, maybe from both sides, in that press
I
conference.
didn't see anything on Zelensky's side. I watched it through, and at the beginning of the meeting, he thanked them. So when James Van said, "You haven't thanked us," at the beginning of the meeting, he's on record. He thanked them. his responses, obviously, he was speaking in a foreign language and having to acquire these things. And having watched, I got very interested in this and watched lots of commentary on it. I think what Vance did was deliberate. He meant to insult him. He meant to humiliate him in front of the population of the world,
Yeah.
with the idea of reducing him so that he would accept a deal giving away $500 billion worth of material. I mean, Trump during the meeting said they'd given, I think it was $350 billion to Ukraine. That's not in fact true. The figure is closer to 120. So he's giving back 4 times more than he's already had. And they want him to do that with no security guarantee. And he, I think, handled the matter with dignity.
Yeah.
And
But
and I don't see that he
I think he
could
sort
have
of did.
said
I
any
think he
more.
sort of did too. But when we're talking about this variations in sensitivity, at best you have to gear your response to the other person's sensitivity. So there's some people you have to praise much more than you.
And I have a letter from King Charles inviting you, Mr. Trump.
Exactly, and even list the good things that that person is doing. You don't have to do that with an
And you have the
everyday
best
normal
hair
person.
I've ever seen, Mr. President. Yeah.
Something like that. So yeah, what can seem normal and good may not be practically adequate in certain situations. So it's hard. I mean, and it's hard if you're attacked to maintain your own cool, right?
Yeah.
So
He didn't respond in kind, and after that, he went into a meeting with them to discuss and then the White House announced, and these are the words that were used, that he had been kicked out.
yeah.
And so you see, we're playing The Apprentice here. This is the game that we've got going here. We're going to humiliate him into a position of weakness. The problem is, if, as Donald J. Trump has said, you view the world as consisting of predators and prey and nothing else, then you are ultimately going to be eaten alive. There is going to come a point, and wow, what a long conversation. But the US has had influence, ethical influence in the world since World War II.
Yeah.
That was all lost in the first month of this presidency. Nobody can trust the United States anymore. And that's a terrible loss. But on the other hand, it probably is time that the world was not reliant upon leadership from the United States. It's probably time that we became a democracy of nations rather than following Russia, China, or America. So who knows what will happen? I hope, I pray, and I'm an agnostic, as you know, but I pray for the poor Ukrainian people in the midst of this.
Just in case. But yeah, I agree. Maybe something
Well, I
good
don't
will
pray to God.
maybe England, France with Zelensky will come up with a strategy to smooth things over with the United States, and everything will go better. But the whole way of doing things may be altered, maybe for the good. I guess time will tell now. But yeah,
it's almost like the shift that George Orwell talks about in 1984, where you have 3 power blocks and one of them is always shifting to another. And you've got this bizarre situation that what may be happening, and I hate to say this, is that the US may be driving Zelensky into the arms of China. And that would be a catastrophe for the US.
He's got to be helped by somebody.
We'll do a 25% deal with you,
Yeah.
And that's the only place in the world that has military systems outside of the US to take on Russia, because Europe has foolishly given over all of its satellite, all of its espionage networks, and all of its weapons systems. We can't arm Ukraine because we don't have the weapons. We rely upon the US. Bad mistake.
Isn't that something? That's right.
Yeah. Oh, well, that has taken us a little bit further away from our usual line of topics.
That's okay.
It's always such a pleasure and a privilege to talk with you, Steve. What can I say? It's great.
Same here.
So thank you. And for those few of you who've managed to get through to the end of this, please do make comments and subscribe and do that kind of stuff and like things. And if you're still phobic about psychiatry, ask us some questions about it. But I can say, having known Stephen for a few years now, that he's a thoroughly decent human being. So there are in that conspiracy to destroy all life in the universe, there are a few wayfaring strangers who've made their way and who do have good feelings. So thank you so much, Steve.
You're welcome.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.